In 1945, the Second World War finally came to an end, leaving behind destruction on a scale the world had never seen before. Millions of soldiers and civilians had lost their lives, cities were reduced to rubble, and entire nations were broken. In Europe, the surrender of Nazi Germany in May marked the end of 6 years of brutal conflict on the continent. Streets that had echoed with gunfire and bombings fell silent, but the silence carried the weight of grief and exhaustion. In the Pacific, Japan fought on until August, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These attacks forced Japan to surrender, ending the war completely. For people everywhere, there was relief that the bloodshed was over, but also fear of what the future might bring. The world had changed forever. Victory brought freedom to many, but it also revealed deep divisions that would soon shape a new struggle. Europe in ruins. When the war ended, Europe was almost unrecognizable. Entire cities were destroyed, with streets filled with broken buildings, burnt homes, and shattered factories. Families who once lived normal lives now found themselves homeless, wandering among the ruins in search of food and shelter. Bridges, railways, and roads were heavily damaged, making it hard to rebuild or even move supplies. Millions of refugees, soldiers, and displaced people crowded into camps, unsure of where they belonged. Starvation and disease spread quickly, as farms and industries had been destroyed. Countries like Germany, Poland, and France faced especially heavy damage, but even Britain, which had stood firm through the war, was left weak and exhausted. Beyond the physical destruction, there was also deep emotional pain. People had lost loved ones, and the horror of war crimes, especially the Holocaust, left wounds that would never fully heal. Europe was free but broken, standing at the edge of a long and difficult recovery. New borders. As the war ended, the map of Europe was redrawn. Old borders disappeared, and new lines were created, often without the choice of the people living there. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and later France. Poland's borders shifted west, losing land to the Soviet Union but gaining territory from Germany. Millions of people were forced to leave their homes and move across these new borders, creating one of the largest migrations in history. Countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary expelled German populations, while the Baltic states were absorbed into the Soviet Union. For many, these changes brought anger and suffering, as centuries-old communities were broken apart. The new borders were meant to secure peace, but instead they laid the foundation for new tensions. East and West Europe began to take shape, divided not only by geography, but also by ideology, setting the stage for future conflict. Rise of USA. After the war, the United States stood as the strongest nation in the world. Unlike Europe, America's cities were untouched by bombing, and its industries had grown during the war by producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies. This gave the U.S. a powerful economy at a time when most countries were struggling to recover. The use of the atomic bomb against Japan showed that America now held unmatched military power. With its wealth and weapons, the U.S. became the leader of the Western world. It offered aid to Europe through programs like the Marshall Plan, helping countries rebuild in exchange for closer political ties. The influence of American culture also began to spread, from movies and music to ideas of democracy and freedom. For many nations, the U.S. was seen as both a protector and a model for the future. But this rise also brought responsibility, as America became deeply involved in global affairs, determined to stop the spread of communism. Soviet expansion. While the United States gained power in the West, the Soviet Union expanded its influence across Eastern Europe. The Red Army had marched deep into the continent to defeat Nazi Germany, and after the war, it remained in control of many countries. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany all came under Soviet influence. The USSR claimed it wanted to protect these nations from future threats, but in reality, it built a strong communist bloc. New governments loyal to Moscow were installed, and opposition was crushed. The Soviets also used resources and industries from these countries to rebuild their own war-damaged land. For people in Eastern Europe, life changed quickly. Freedom of speech was limited, political opponents disappeared, and economies were reshaped under communist rule. This expansion worried the West, especially the United States, which saw it as the beginning of a dangerous divide. The world was no longer united by victory. It was splitting into two rival camps. Cold War begins. The end of World War II did not bring full peace. Instead, a new kind of conflict emerged between the United States and the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. Unlike traditional wars, this was not fought with direct battles, but with fear, rivalry, and competition. The world became divided into two sides: the West, led by the US and its allies, and the East, controlled by the Soviet Union and its communist states. Both powers tried to spread their influence, offering aid, forming military alliances, and competing for control of weaker nations. Nuclear weapons made the tension even greater, as each side feared the other might strike first. People lived with the constant threat of war breaking out again, even though no large-scale battle happened between the superpowers. Instead, the Cold War shaped politics, economies, and societies across the globe, turning former allies into bitter rivals for decades. Rebuilding Europe. After the destruction of World War II, rebuilding Europe became one of the greatest challenges of the century. Cities lay in ruins, industries had collapsed, and millions were homeless. To recover, countries needed both money and stability. The United States stepped in with the Marshall Plan, a massive program of financial aid that helped Western European nations rebuild their economies, repair infrastructure, and modernize industries. This not only brought recovery, but also tied these nations closer to the US. In the East, the Soviet Union rejected Western aid and forced its satellite states to follow its own communist economic system, known as Comecon. While Western Europe began to grow stronger and more prosperous, Eastern Europe struggled under strict control and shortages. Rebuilding was not only about physical structures, but also about restoring trust, hope, and unity among people who had suffered so much. Slowly, Europe started to rise again, divided but determined to move forward. Lasting impact. The aftermath of World War II left a mark that still shapes the world today. The war ended old empires and created two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, whose rivalry dominated global politics for decades. Europe was divided into East and West, with democracy and capitalism on one side and communism on the other. The United Nations was created to prevent future wars, giving nations a place to solve conflicts through diplomacy instead of violence. The horrors of the Holocaust pushed the world to defend human rights and seek justice against war crimes. Economies were rebuilt, but the scars of destruction and loss remained in families and communities. Former colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East also saw the war as a turning point, beginning their struggles for independence. The legacy of World War II is more than history. It is the foundation of the modern world, its conflicts, alliances, and lessons.